We're seeing throughout the country this push, particularly on the state level, for anti-critical race theory legislation. And there has been a lot of reporting on how a lot of this effort is astroturfed, Koch money coming in, a breath of GOP money also buttressing it. And while there is an organic desire to ban critical race theory that fomented by right-wing media, but like there are people who are genuinely invested in it, it has been amplified and has just exploded because of this money. And a lot of that is driven by state and local politicians who are helping this effort along, including this New Hampshire state representative, Erica Layton. She was asked by a local reporter there named Adam Sexton about the anti-critical race theory bill that's going through the New Hampshire State House right now. Listen to her answer on how she believes that under her new educational system that she's envisioning, how the 3/5 compromise would be taught if basically the concept of racism is not allowed to be taught in schools.
If this became law, what would be the appropriate way for a teacher to address something like the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, which basically invalidated the humanity of enslaved people who were black in America? I mean, that's a racist aspect of America's founding. Does that run afoul somehow to bring this up in the classroom?
Well, when you're bringing this up in the classroom, you should go back to some of the historical documents. The 3/5 compromise actually made it so that the slaveholding South didn't have more of a voice in Congress. They actually were worried that if, for representation, they counted each slave as a whole vote and a whole voter, that then there might be more slavery throughout the country, and that it would be unequal. It would be unequal because a viewpoint that was on its way out would be overrepresented. So the idea of saying that somebody is less than a human is abhorrent. It's terrible. It's something that we shouldn't do. They were trying to figure out how to have a representative democracy without having a toxic view take hold and overwhelm
Toxic
the rest
view.
of this new
Pause it. I'm sorry. Just pause it really quickly. It gets a lot worse. But just the idea that this would, like, the passivity with which she treats slavery as just a viewpoint, a toxic view that was on its way out. It was not a viewpoint. It was the foundation of an economic system that benefited like countless wealthy landowners and property owners in this country. And that's why there had to be even a compromise about this.
And I just think
like, on the way out, I think like close to like what 80, 90 years it took between what they're talking about and then it being on the way out.
On this way out.
I think like the problem is kind of in the question too. Like they didn't do that just to invalidate their humanity. They did it to empower the slave plantation class by recognizing their humanity at a discount and saying, oh, that we're going to count them. And you can tell the way she says like as recognized as vote, like, oh, they clearly weren't given a vote, were they? Right. But they wanted to give that population so the southern states weren't just completely swamped by the northern states. That was clearly just to empower the slave owning class. That's why it was. And like it did invalidate their humanity, right? But I think like that's not why they did it. And I think we need to have a more clear-eyed view of why these things were done.
She also. Okay, go on, Brandon.
No, I was just going to say it's just interesting because you're right, Matt. It was 3/5. They were counted as 3/5 of a person in the population. They weren't given 3/5 of a vote. They were just allowed as a population in the South to pretend like they had more people because the South was largely just a few plantations, a few like white workers, and the slave population was getting larger than the white population. So it makes more sense. The only thing I would say is that like they framed this as though like, oh, it's a lesson in history. It was something that was going to be phased out. We wouldn't want people, rather, it's implied that it would just taint people's view of America in a way that would make them less patriotic in some sense. Because I think part of why people get caught up in this is that because like, the founding of America is treated as such an important thing because, in our politics, you got to have that American exceptionalism myth hammered into your head that like any of the genocides that we did in order to establish America, native populations, slavery, black people, etc., are viewed in sort of just a sort of that thing had to happen in order to get to America. So how bad can it be? Just throughout history and how we understand history and how we understand genocides too are often framed in that context of like, well, this genocide was necessary to form a Western country versus another genocide that was somehow anomalous to the standards of Western countries or the standards that we eventually decided to hold Western countries to, like apartheid, and obviously people talk about Palestine and Israel as well in this sort of context of like, how do we get people to understand that genocide is bad and not just like make excuses for certain types of genocide or certain types of human rights violations if they're put as like into this timeline of American history. The only other part of that too is that like it's put in this timeline in American history to pretend like it's not still happening, but we know that in the South they expand their population numbers by counting prisoners in prisons in certain counties in the South, which is why they build them big to inflate their population numbers as well. So they're still doing stuff like this. So not teaching it in the past has a direct effect on how people understand what's going on currently in our system because it's still happening. And so
that's the point. I mean,
well,
exactly.
I would just, exactly, Brandon, and I would just enlarge on the point. We have this blog from Luke O'Neill's Substack, and I'll just read a section of it here. For example, 60% of Illinois prisoners are from Cook County, Chicago, yet 99% of them are counted outside the county. Pretty slick shit, right? First, you arrest predominantly black people from large population centers that tend to vote Democrat. Next, you cage them in more rural places where the prisoners are thereby inflating that district's raw representational power. Now, areas who rely on prisons for jobs and power and wealth can have a leg up on passing legislation that will send more black people into those same prisons in a massive feedback loop of disenfranchisement. And then he editorializes, understanding all that, you might get why Republicans are so fucking afraid of kids being taught how our country actually works and how it has always been for centuries of cheating to ensure entrenched minority rule by depriving as many people as possible, besides white Christian conservatives, the power to vote. And I mean, so not ancient history at all. It's very much still a part of our electoral politics.
Well, let's let her finish her answer here, because honestly, it gets worse from that. I just wanted to take the time to dissect the first part of her answer. The second part is so explicitly just false that it obviously, as I mentioned, it gets worse.
A representative democracy without having a toxic view take hold and overwhelm the rest of this new forming country.
It was rational, but it was also racist, though, right?
I mean, it's not a good thing to do. If you look at it, it was all slaves. So when you had indentured slaves that were coming over from Ireland, they also counted as 3/5.
Nope.
My family, the Indians, I'm part Cherokee, we were also counted as 3/5 within that.
No.
So it wasn't good. But when you look at what else was happening in the world at the time, you didn't have representative democracies.
Okay, yeah, so that literally is exactly what Brandon was saying, right? The formation of America justifies all of this, and so that was perfect. I don't think you've seen the clip before, so there you go. But that is not true. Indentured servants were explicitly excluded from the 3/5 compromise in that area, and she calls them indentured slaves. She really is comparing the indentured servitude of, say, like she said, Irish people. That is not accurate. Oftentimes, like, indentured servitude was a way to serve the capitalist class as well. Yes, but they also had the ability to then, once they graduated from that indentured servitude, then that would often turn into apprenticeships. And it was a way for there to be like a semblance of upward mobility for basically only white people. That's what the reality was.
I mean, if you survived a year period of indenture, which wasn't the case typically early on, then you would, get some a lot more rights. And this was true of even black people too. Like there were folks who got the freedom, and of course, eventually a racialized, a more hyper racialized version of slavery emerged from the plantation system.
Yeah. All right. Well, then good. We can move on from that.
I just think that we have to acknowledge the existence of the Black Irish if we're going to, be a unified left.
Also, I take back what I said.
Erasure.
I didn't realize she was a POC, so she's
I mean,
Cherokee.
I have zero faith. I mean, like, who's more Native American, that woman or Elizabeth Warren? Like, let's be real here.
Oh, bringing up the old school beef.
It's never a low blow to remind people about that one. That was funny because people got
Yeah,
really invested in how reasonable a lie that was to tell. And I'm like, okay, well, the lies that are reasonable to tell yourself and tell your friends, as like trying to prove you're interesting, are not reasonable to tell the entire population. You just got to know the difference.
Yeah,
But I mean, I would also just say like it's amazing how little Americans know about their own history and the history of the world to allow, people to say stuff like that. Like America was actually pretty progressive for the time when it comes to things like race and democracy. It's like, I don't know about that. Depending on what time that you mean, America, like I think was one of the last countries to abolish slavery, and it's like in terms of its on its home soil, and they had to fight a war about it. It's like so a lot of the the myths, or rather the myth of American exceptionalism, I think is one of the most pervasive conspiracy theories that Americans are taught because it does really alienate them from the rest of the world by having such a poor grasp on like where they're situated in so many of these things, not even just in terms of what's going on in their own country, but like, yeah, them Americans thinking they're better than everyone else is like relies on them not knowing anything about anywhere else or themselves, which is kind of hard to, come to terms with. But like stuff like this, where it's like, okay, well, they don't want you to know what's going on in the past, so you don't know what's going on in the present, so you don't realize just how little progress we've actually made compared to what's going on in the rest of the entire world. And so, it's like an open air prison here.
Well, I mean, that's the explicit project of this anti-critical race theory stuff, is they want to rewrite history because it's so unfavorable to conservatives. You can uphold American exceptionalism and by, like, just as a twin effect, uphold white supremacy and completely revisionist history of racism that allows people to, like, naturalize the conditions that we're currently living under today. That's the entire point.
And I would just encourage, reporters get a little bit more savvy about what this is doing for power, right? Like, why is this being pursued for power as opposed to, like, I agree, like the way you put it, what did you say? Like, invalidate their humanity,
reporter,
right?
I mean,
but like, and that's the register we're taught to speak in these things, but that's still kind of on a more individualistic, almost register of things. This stuff was done. It's conspiracy, right, by power.
Yeah, definitely. And I think part of that conspiracy is like, not part of it, but a lot of it has to do with muddying the waters around stuff like she mentioned there. Like he was like, was it racist? He's like, I don't know if you would call having slaves of a particular race racist, but certainly, it was not good. And like the continued muddying of these waters surrounding what it means to be racist, what it means to be sexist, what it means to be, like both, and also like the relationship that has to like power, as Matt said, and capitalism as a function of power as well, or power's function of capitalism as well, is all obscured at this like the lowest levels by like being unable to even like admit that like slavery was a bad thing that happened and was done specifically to people of a specific race for a specific, economic and social purpose, and that's what makes it racist at the, not just at the personal level of like the very specific slave owners, which I mean, honestly, we muddy the waters around whether like they're racist or not through like the vehicle of talking about the founding fathers and like how they did some good things and bad things.
Yeah.
But just generally like the entire project of like America, whether or not we understand what racism means as not necessarily like an intellectual and moral failure of people individually, or even an intellectual moral failure of like a country, but like these like sort of systems that are like in play to maintain power.
Yep. All right, let's
to the really quick to that what was brought up at the end there about like it was this like a local news reporter. Like oddly enough, I think it's even more important that local news reporters get with it in terms of like these things, because a lot of these people who don't trust like the media for some reason or another still trust their like local news outlets, like their local affiliates. So the fact that they so often sort of drop the ball on these more like, these issues where it requires some sort of a beyond local, mindset, I guess you can say, to try to, to approach certain topics. I think they need to get better with that for sure. This often happens where they just drop the ball completely on like just talking to a local person or a local politician. No need to put this in the context of the broader like beliefs or ideologies that are spreading throughout the country. Just a local news thing.
I would agree. I also think that, some people are just generally unprepared, not to make excuses for anybody, because, the local filtering to the global, and, that sort of pipeline is, important to understand. But, I could imagine being surprised by how shameless some of these people are about stuff like this. Like just like how when someone tells you like, well, slavery wasn't racist, basically to your face, just like being, and you shouldn't be surprised, that's just our country, but like, you would be surprised that I think the depth that these Republicans will say, what will come out of their mouths in terms of just like how divorced they are from reality and also common decency. But you got prepared for that. You can't just be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So you really don't think this is true? Okay. Like, because like, yeah, then it just becomes a he said, she said kind of like our, interview.